This is the lecture for European history for Thursday, the 20th?
Yes, sir.
The 20th of May 2021. This is a new desk arrangement, or should I say a reversion to my normal traditional desk arrangement. You can sit where you like. Largely, if you have a special desire to sit anywhere particular, let me know and I can make arrangements. Where we left things was that the Mediterranean, South Mediterranean coast in North Africa had been cleared of the Axis powers. Sicily also, and Italy was the site of several stalemate battles. Now we shift to the Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, the Russians held the line at Stalingrad, but the line was deep inside of Russia. There was a bulge in central Russia at a place called Kursk. At Kursk, the Russians hold a bulge of territory that lengthens the line and threatens the Germans. So what the German High Command, what Hitler insists on for his offensive is not like in Operation Barbarossa the first year, where they're going to go for Leningrad and Moscow and Kiev and take the country. No, that ambition's gone. They're not even going to go for the oil fields at Baku. What they're going to do is try to pinch out this salient, this bulge, this pocket of Russian troops deep into German territory. The Russians know about it. 6 hours before the sneaky German attack, the Russians hit the Germans with an artillery barrage to break up their attack formations. This is a bad sign. When the enemy sneak attacks you just as you're getting ready to sneak attack them, that is a bad sign. Further, when the Germans penetrate the Russian lines, they discover that the Russians have secondary defenses dug, tertiary defenses dug, quaternary defenses dug. They've got defense line after defense line after defense line. And the Russians have swarmed the area with tanks, planes, guns. In other words, they're ready. The Germans are not thrilled by this. Now, the Germans do have a special set of new tanks, Tiger tanks and Panther tanks, really big, much more powerful individually. But there are relatively few of them, and they're very complicated, which means they break down all the time. Wilson?
Yes.
Okay. So, this opens up the largest tank battle in the history of mankind. For weeks, then a month, the Germans and Russians contend at Kursk. Swarms of tanks, squadrons of tanks, ride at one another and are destroyed. Stevens? The new seating is going to confuse me just a little bit. By the way, you're not locked into where you're sitting today either. You might find a better place that you want to be. The tanks are not only destroying one another, but massive numbers of anti-tank weapons, including artillery and rockets, are also going to be used. Finally, though, the German attack at Kursk fails. It's the last attempt by the Germans to attack the Russians in World War II, and that is in the summer of 1943, July through August of 1943. Kaylee. There you go. Now, you're welcome. Before this, go on. We're going to Warsaw, capital of the former country of Poland, on the Vistula River. Warsaw has an old medieval Jewish ghetto, designed to house maybe 20,000 people. The Germans are going to use it as a concentration camp ghetto. They're going to pack, at times, upwards of 80,000, 90,000 people into this ghetto. Please make sure your notes are. They're going to do it by just shoving people in and letting them die in the streets. And the Jews are going to clean up the bodies and pile them up and burn them under German authority. Therefore, the Jews suffer overcrowding, disease, starvation, death by forced labor, and all sorts of other things in this ghetto. Life is hard. Lots of people die. Germans are fine with that. And then trains begin arriving that are going to take Jews to the east to work as farm laborers. It's not an easy life, it's not a nice life, but it's life. You work as peasants on new German plantations in the east. But credible rumors begin to arrive in Warsaw. These credible rumors involve evidence that the trains are in fact not going to some farming area in the east. They go to Treblinka or Auschwitz or other places which are literally factories that turn living human beings into dead human beings. As hard as that is to believe. So the leadership of the ghetto decides if we're going to die, and that seems to be our fate, we'd rather die on our feet than die on our knees. So the ghetto leadership begins to marshal the manpower, the men, women, and children of the ghetto, and disperse weapons to strike groups that are going to be able to hit Germans and take more weapons and more ammunition from them. The Warsaw Ghetto leadership also contacts the nationalist underground. That is the Polish resistance that works with the government of Poland that fled to London at the beginning of the war. The Polish resistance is also preparing uprisings against the Germans. But the resistance says that the Russians are still close to 1,000 miles east of us at Kursk. Without the Russian army close, any uprising is doomed to failure. We want to rise up. We wouldn't mind rising up with you. We're stronger certainly together than apart, but we are not going to engage in suicide. We can't help you. Except with a few weapons and medical supplies. The Jews say, we really don't have any choice. It's not a question of waiting. If we wait, we get shipped off to die. We're going to fight regardless. So, in April and May of 1943, just before Kursk actually, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising occurs. Now, you're going to have to be clear. The Ghetto Uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 is a distinct event from what happens later, the Warsaw Uprising. In the Ghetto Uprising, the ghetto fighters drive the Germans out of the ghetto and out of some neighboring neighborhoods in Warsaw. They surprise the Germans. They are really good at capturing weapons, killing Germans, taking territory, sneak attacks, using the sewers, using the rooftops, using whatever methods they can to turn the ghetto area into a strainer of death for Germans. The Germans at first are shocked, then they form up around the ghetto to cut it off from all outside support, and then inexorably and systematically they drive towards the center of the ghetto, flattening it, killing almost anyone that doesn't immediately surrender, even killing some that do. By the end of May, the ghetto uprising is over. Many in the ghetto, a significant proportion of the population, are killed in the fighting or because of the fighting. The Germans make no distinction between civilians and soldiers. And the surviving people in the ghetto are shipped out to the death camps. But it is the largest example of Jews fighting back against the final solution. There were other smaller cases of Jewish armed resistance, But nothing compares to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in scale and in success. In Israel, after the war, a special kibbutz was set up for the surviving Warsaw Ghetto fighters who were able to come and live on this collective farm together, voluntary collective farm, with other people who went through that hell together. But after the Battle of Kursk, the Russian army is ready to advance. In Operation Bagration, named after a Russian general of Napoleonic War era, the Russians advance in a series of lurches from Kursk all the way to the Vistula River in a year. The Germans are incapable of doing anything but slowing the Russians down in places. The Russians have a massive advantage in the air, in tanks, in numbers, in terms of trucks, in terms of fuel, in terms of aircraft. A lot of it supplied by the Americans and the British through our system of convoys to Russia that have to go through a gauntlet of German submarines. A lot of it because Russian industry has moved east of the Urals and is now in full production, using slave labor. One of the innovations the Russians bring to the battlefield is the Katusha rocket launcher. The Katusha rocket launcher is basically a truck, a pickup truck, big pickup truck, with 50 rocket tubes on its back in a launcher. You can aim the launcher generally. In these 50 rocket tubes are unguided rockets with explosive warheads. When they fire, they make an almost musical sound, so the Germans quickly start calling them Stalin's organ. The Katyushas are designed basically to flatten anything in a several football field-sized area. If Katyushas start landing and you don't immediately get underground, you're probably going to die. So it's an area attack weapon. The Russians are unstoppable. The Germans are not even allowed to fight smart, though, because Hitler says stand and die, stand and die, stand and die. He doesn't allow the German high command to retreat and fortify a new line, which dooms the Germans in the east to defeat. By the summer of 1944, a year after the Battle of Kursk, just over a year after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Russian troops arrive at the eastern shores of the Vistula River near Warsaw. They can see Warsaw across the river. Now is the time. The nationalist uprising is to begin. The nationalist Poles rise up throughout the city of Warsaw, men, women, and children, and they fight. And the Germans are driven out of large areas of Warsaw. At first they're shocked, but also they're confused. Who do we fight? Do we fight these Polish rebels? Or do we continue to try to defend ourselves against the Red Army of the Soviet Union? And then to their joy, the Germans notice the Russians sitting down and drinking tea and eating borscht. The Russian army stops on the eastern shore of the Vistula, and they show no signs of continuing their attack. Oh, the Germans say, we can deal with the uprising. And all the rage and all the anger pent up over a year of defeats and ongoing pressure by the Red Army can be vented on these Poles. So the Germans surround Warsaw's environs and they drive in, flattening neighborhood by neighborhood, killing Poles profligately. The Poles ask the Russians, should I say, when are you attacking? The Russians don't reply. The Poles contact their government in London, asking the Allies to find out why the Russians won't attack. When the Americans and British ask the Russians, the Russian ambassador says, well, our army moves in a series of lurching attacks. We build up massive amounts of manpower, ammunition, weapons, and then we surge forward until those are all expended. Then we hold the new line and wait until we have this again, and then we surge forward again. Right now, we're in a stage of replenishment. We're going to be there for at least a month or two. Nothing we can do about it. To which the Allies say, Right. But what are they going to do? Oh, wait. What we want to do, Russians, we, the British and the Americans, is take our 4-engine bombers, of which we have thousands and thousands, fly them to Warsaw, bomb the German positions around the poles, land in Russian-controlled airfields, refuel, go back, and we'll shuttle bomb Warsaw. All you have to do, we'll even bring our own fuel in, all you have to do is let us land. The Russians say, we're sorry. Our military is highly trained to shoot down any aircraft that is not a Russian aircraft. We are concerned that there is a 100% chance that our soldiers will accidentally shoot down British and American planes. Please don't do this because we can't guarantee the results. What they're really saying is, we're not going to help the Polish nationalists, and we're not going to let you help the Polish nationalists. And you may wonder why. Well, the reason is, this has nothing to do with World War II. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States begins in August of 1944 with the beginning of the Warsaw Uprising. Not the Ghetto Uprising, the Uprising. Remember the Katyn Forest Massacre. The Russians did not then, and do not now, want Polish leadership to survive the war. They don't want Polish engineers, Polish lawyers, teachers, doctors, architects, college professors, doctors, lawyers, whatever, army officers. They want them gone. They want Poland to be a colony of theirs, a puppet state, a satellite country. This is about getting the anti-communist Poles to die fighting the Germans, and their enemies, the Germans, to die fighting the anti-communist Poles. This is about rendering the Polish government in London useless. You see, when Russia invaded eastern Polish territory, at the city of Lublin, a group of Polish communists declared themselves the Polish government. These Lublin Poles are absolute puppets of the Soviet Union. They're Polish communists, in the pay of the Russians, at the mercy of the Russians. They're going to do whatever the Russians tell them to do. It is the Lublin Poles that the Russians want to rule Poland after the war, which means Russia will rule Poland after the war. So this is not about defeating Germany. This is about keeping control of as much territory as the Russian army advances into. It is an act of Cold War Soviet aggression, not of the Russian allies fighting against the common enemy, German. Still, the uprising goes on for over 2 months, August, September, October. Ultimately, the Polish nationalists are destroyed in Warsaw. Less than a week after the end of the German attacks in Warsaw, the Russian army resumes its advance into Poland. They were clearly simply waiting for the nationalists to be exterminated. A few months later, the Russian army, actually at about the same time, the Russian army enters East Prussia and enters Silesia and other bits of German territory. The frontline Russian troops are not too bad to the civilians. They are too busy fighting the Wehrmacht, the German army. The second, third, fourth, and fifth line Russian troops are a different story entirely. The horrible cry, Frau, kommen! Women, come! Is heard on every farm that the Russians arrive in, every city block, every town neighborhood, every village square. Every girl over age 8, up to age 80 and beyond, every female is then raped, not by individual Russian soldiers, but by units of them in succession, one after the other, after the other. Many of the females do not survive this. Those that do are never the same. This is the point. This is not an aberration. This is not an accident. The Red Army uses massive rape as a form of crowd control. By arriving and doing this to the women of Germany, they're proving to everyone that the men of Germany cannot protect them anymore, that the Russians are in charge, and that the Germans can do nothing about it unless they want to commit suicide. 9 months later, all sorts of children of these rapes are born. The Russians demonstrate without any doubt who's in charge. Now, the Russians are the worst at this. The Japanese, though, also do this. They use massive military unit rape as a form of terror and crowd control. You can stop or just rip it off. It's the constant deep, deep, deep that bothers me. Thank you. The Chinese nationalists, who are our allies, do it a bit, not much. The Germans do it a bit, not much. It's really not their thing. The only armies that really take steps against this sort of thing are the British and the Americans, and to a lesser degree the French, when they get back in the war. It's a horror show. Now, you got to understand what the Germans did in Russia was just as bad. They didn't use massive rape. What they did is they just killed anyone en masse that they thought was an enemy. They killed Jews, they killed communists, they killed doctors, lawyers, professionals. They stripped the area of anything they wanted. They turned any surviving Russian to slave labor. The Germans committed crimes against humanity on a scale heretofore unheard of in modern history. And when the Russians come into Germany, it's payback time. That's how they see it. This is revenge for what the Germans did to Mother Russia. Over 30 million Russians are killed as a result of the German invasion in the Second World War. That's a lot. That's 30 times, well, 25, 30 times the population of Idaho. So the Germans become intensely interested in helping anyone fight the Russians. But in the end, the Russians reach the Oder River near Berlin, and they cross the Oder River and fight their way into Berlin. And at Stalingrad, too, the second street battle, the second room-to-room, house-to-house, floor-to-floor fighting, just like in Stalingrad. But this is the last battle in Germany. It's the battle for the capital. The Americans could have taken Berlin, but it was going to be in the Russian zone of occupation after the war. The Allies had prearranged this. The American and British leader, American General Eisenhower, said, why should Western boys die for a city we're not even going to have after the war? Let the Russians take the casualties. Let the Russians take Berlin. And they do. And we'll talk about the end of that when we come back to it. Now we go to the Western Front. We're back in 1942-43. By 1942, the British have been fighting for over 3 years. And since they can't fight on the European mainland on land, British bombers go over German-occupied territory and even Germany itself and drop bombs. No more leaflet attacks. These are real bombs. The British and the Americans are the only nations in World War II to mass-produce 4-engine bombers, which are very large bombers that can drop between 15 and 20,000 tons of explosives on an enemy target. But the British learned very early in the war that if you go into German airspace, especially over Germany itself, by day, you're suicided. You can't do that. The German fighters will wither and kill you. So the British engage in night fighting, night bombing. They don't bomb factories or bridges, they bomb cities. Now, there are people now, long after the war, who aren't at risk, and there were people during the war who said, this is barbarous, you're attacking civilians. The British say, damn right we are. Just like the Germans did in Warsaw, when they terror bombed Warsaw. Just like they did in Rotterdam, Holland, when they terror bombed Rotterdam. The Germans didn't just destroy sections of London in the Blitz, they destroyed the entire British city of Coventry in one night. The British countryside is littered with cities burned out and destroyed by German bombers. They started it. They sowed the wind. This is the whirlwind. Sucks to be them that they can't do it, that they didn't do this horrible work as well as we do. The British are unapologetic about their night bombing campaign against cities. But when the Americans arrive in 1942, we're pretty arrogant. We say, we've got a much better bomber than you do. We have the B-17 Flying Fortress. It can carry about as many bombs as your best bomber, and it's armed with between 10 and 15 heavy machine guns. Much better weapons than the British bombers have. We also have the Norden bomb sight, a mechanical computer that allows us to precisely bomb building-sized targets. We're not going to bomb randomly at night. No, no, no. we're going to bomb by day. Our bombers will defend themselves with their machine guns, and will use the Norden bomb site to destroy enemy war factories, bridges, rail yards, roads. We're going to hit like a surgeon, while the British lash out like a brawler. Yeah.
Do we have the B-52 Stratofortress at this point?
No, that's Cold War era.
Okay.
That's 10 or 15 years later. We had the B-17 Flying Fortress, and then at the end of the war, the B-29 Super Fortress, which is the atomic bomber. But no B-52s yet. B-52 is an incredible weapon. So are all of them, really. The trouble is, we're arrogant. We don't appreciate that the Germans are speaking, that the British are speaking from real experience when they say, if you bomb Germany by day, you're asking for it. At 2 raids alone, Regensburg and Schweinfurt, American bombers suffer 50% or more casualties. For every American bomber shot down, at least 10 crewmen are killed or captured. That means in a single afternoon, you can lose 10,000 men or more, depending upon how many bombers you send in. It quickly becomes apparent that as good as the B-17 is with its machine guns, unless it has escort fighters, long-range fighter planes to defend the bombers as they go into German-controlled airspace, it's suicide. So we pause in daylight bombing for a while and then develop increasingly better long-range fighters. What this allows is for President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill at Casablanca Conference to agree on a policy of what is called round-the-clock bombing. The British and the Americans are going to coordinate their strategic bombing of German targets. By day, the Americans will bomb particular buildings, factories, war sites. By night, the British will bomb the whole area. The combination of day and night bombing will shatter German morale, will exhaust the Germans' ability to fight fires, will make the bombing campaign much more effective. So round-the-clock bombing is the way we fight before we land troops in Western Europe. But the plan is always to land troops in Western Europe. Quickly.
No, you have USAAF up there.
U.S. Army Air Force.
Wouldn't it be the U.S. Army Air Corps?
It became the Army Air Forces early in the war.
Okay.
Good point, though. Good point. By 1944, huge numbers of Americans and Brits are ready to cross the English Channel and invade France. Everyone expects the narrowest point of the English Channel to be used. The Germans and Hitler certainly expect that. So that's where General Patton goes. General Patton, the famous American general who slapped the guys because he didn't believe in post-traumatic stress disorder, is given command of the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG. And it's clear that FUSAG is going to cross the channel at the Pas de Calais, and this is the general that the Germans fear the most. It's a dummy army with balloon tanks. Literally, balloons in the shape of tanks, with trucks made of cardboard, fake formations of men, fake records. It is a complete bluff designed to feed Hitler's certainty that the attack will happen at the Pas de Calais. Even a couple of spies are dropped in the drink after they die to be picked up or washed ashore in German-occupied France with false plans showing the invasion of Pas de Calais. The real attack is going to happen from western and southern England onto the Normandy Peninsula. It's going to be William the Conqueror's attack in reverse. This time England's going to invade Normandy. You're going to have to wait because I have a lot to do. So, every month there's a window when the tides are right for invasion. And the window in early June is simultaneous with a series of terrible storms that are coming in from the Atlantic and beating England and France. These storms are so bad, the Germans say nobody's going to be able to attack now. So most of the German field commanders go to Paris for some rest, recreation, and a war games seminar. The night of June 4th/5th, /5th, 1944, the American commander Eisenhower preliminarily orders troops into boats and for people to get ready. But the weather is just so bad that night, he cancels it. However, the next day he hears that there's going to be a break in the weather going from west to east. For just a few days, Eisenhower makes the gamble that that will be long enough to land troops in Normandy. So the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, the troops get into ships, they start going south across the channel, and airborne soldiers, paratroopers, land behind the lines. At dawn, June 6, 1944, British, Canadian, and Empire forces land at Gold, Sword, and Juno Beach on the right side of the Normandy Peninsula, the east side. Americans land at Utah Beach on the west side, the northwest side of the Normandy Peninsula, and at Omaha Beach between Utah and the British beaches. But Omaha Beach is the key. There's a cliff 200 feet high overlooking the beach. That cliff is honeycombed with German tunnels and gun emplacements, machine guns, artillery, everything in between. Our first wave of troops lands at Omaha and is slaughtered, almost wiped out. The second wave goes in and is slaughtered, almost wiped out. And when people are landing, they're landing so far away from where they had planned to land because the boats that are landing them are panicking, the people commanding them, that their maps don't even include where they actually are because they have very detailed maps of a very small area where they're supposed to fight, and they're over here. By the third wave, which also takes ridiculous casualties, Eisenhower isn't sure of whether he'll have to pull those men that landed off the beaches. Eisenhower had pre-written two messages. One, a message of victory, the other, a message, well, we tried. We tried our best. I take personal responsibility for the failure of the landings at Normandy. We'll have to try again some other time. Because of the difficulties at Normandy, at Omaha Beach, Eisenhower is not sure which message he's going to be able to send out. Because without Omaha, it's unclear whether or not the Allies will actually succeed. However, by the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th waves, the Americans begin to hold their own. They push up over the cliff, and they start attacking the Germans from above as well as from below. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, the D-Day invasion has occurred successfully. Operation Overlord has begun. The battle for Normandy has begun. And Anglo-American and Canadian forces are established in Normandy. Throughout all of this, everyone wonders, where's the reserve of German tanks? The big mobile reserve of German tanks is being held in Paris. At first, where are the German tanks? Well, Hitler has to make the orders to make those tanks move. When the attacks begin, the Fuhrer headquarters is called. And the generals in the field are told the Fuhrer has just taken a sleeping pill. He's not to be disturbed until he wakes up the next morning. But the Fuhrer is not to be disturbed until the next morning. So Hitler sleeps through the critical hours of invasion when his orders might have gotten the tanks to Normandy Beach. When he wakes up, he's furious, of course, because Hitler, and he refuses to let the tanks go. Because Hitler still believes General Patton's going to land over here at the Pas-de-Calais, that Normandy is a diversion. It takes a couple of weeks before Hitler really accepts the truth that there is no attack here, that the real attack is here. By then, he has sent the tanks in, but it's too late. Yes?
Oh. Well, I've been watching Band of Brothers quite a bit lately, and one of the things that they showed, I forget the exact battle that it was, but it was like D-Day plus 18 or something like that. And the United States Airborne, along with some other British people, were scouting out this certain area, and then they met enemy contacts, started at 0500 in the morning, and they were completely ambushed by tanks. So it just started going downhill, but then it's some crazy stuff that ends up happening.
I think it was just after Tarentine.
Yes, just after Tarentine.
Our troops in Normandy are faced by a geographical problem. For 1,000 years, since the Frenchified Vikings were given Normandy by the King of France in order to keep the rest of the Vikings off of France, which works, the French Normans have been building hedgerows. Imagine a mound of earth and stone about as tall as my neck. And planted in it are a series of thorn hedges that are each about 10 or 15 feet tall, maybe even 20 feet tall, depending, that are thick. These are around every field, on both sides of almost every road. Every field, every road, every street corner becomes a fortress. The hedgerows make fighting inland from Normandy slow and arduous, almost like World War I. But by the end of the summer, or by mid to late July, enough American forces are there to form the Third Army, America's tank army. And General Patton is given command because he's the most aggressive general we have, and you need an aggressive general in charge of tanks. Operation Cobra has the British holding the Germans in the east, and in the west, the American Third Tank Army breaks through, wheels around, and hits the Germans from the rear. The Germans then begin a massive retreat from Normandy. But a gap is left at a French town called Falaise. At Falaise, this gap is left so that, among other things, Allied bombers can see what they can do to an army in the field. And for days and days, the British and American heavy bombers bomb the Falaise Gap. It does have a terrifying effect on the German army. But before the troops actually close this gap, lots of Germans do escape eastward. For the rest of July into August, the American Third Army, the British, and the American other forces drive through France. Paris is liberated. It declares itself a free city, and we let the obnoxious French general Charles de Gaulle lead the marching into Paris because free French is political, and it creates the impression that the French liberated France, which is just not true. In any event, by August, September, we're fighting in Belgium and in the Vosges Mountains in Alsace-Lorraine against the Germans. So we're back almost to where the war in the West began. The British general Montgomery has a plan called Operation Market Garden to land paratroops simultaneously at a dozen bridges between the British lines and the Rhine River. By landing the troops simultaneously, the paratroops will have to hold for up to one day. A British tank army called 30 Corps will ride up a single highway over the bridges the parachute troops hold and ride across the Rhine River, which is a barrier, into Germany in autumn 1944, and maybe we can win the war by Christmas. The problem is we don't have enough planes to land our paratroopers simultaneously. Instead of landing them all at once, we land them in 3 waves. The first wave is a complete shock and surprise. We have success. The second wave, the Germans are figuring out what's going on. It's pretty obvious. Our paratroopers are taking a narrow line of bridges. 30 Corps has already begun riding up the single highway. Everyone knows what the target is. So when the third wave is dropped, a Polish unit, for example, is dropped near Arnhem, where the bridge over the Rhine is. The Poles are going to reinforce the British that are holding part of the bridge. But the Germans are waiting in the field below them, and they just machine gun the Poles as they're floating down in their parachutes. It's a slaughter. Market Garden fails because the paratroopers don't have enough planes to land simultaneously, and because 30 Corps relies on a single road. What happens on a single road when a tank is blown up? Well, it takes 10 or 15 minutes for a construction vehicle to bulldoze the tank off the road, and if the construction vehicle isn't self-destroyed, then the tanks slowly move up again. Everything bottles up. It's a traffic jam. So it takes too long. Market Garden fails. So what it looks like is that the Western Front will go into hibernation for the winter, because the Germans haven't launched an attack in wintertime since Frederick the Great. They'll fight in the east because the Russians aren't going to stop for winter. They're Russians. They like fighting in the winter. But in the west, everyone expects on the Allied side it's going to be quiet. No. The Germans are going to attack because Hitler thinks he can break the Anglo-American alliance. See, the Brits resent the Americans. The Americans, when they were waiting in Britain to invade France, the Brits had a saying. There are only 3 problems with the Yanks. They're overpaid, they're oversexed, and they're over here. An American made 5 times as much as a British soldier. British women were dating Americans because Americans could show them a better time. Plus, they were exotic with that weird American accent. The British and the Americans tended to be rude and dismissive and arrogant towards the Brits in their own country. Sometimes. I mean, ugly American. There were ugly Brits, too. The worst tourists in the world, there were Russians and Chinese who come from the communist country and the former communist country. They're just nasty. Learn about it if you don't know. I'm not just casting aspersion. I'm telling you what I've learned. So Hitler's going to maul the American army. Now, his attack comes in a place nobody expects. See, the Ardennes, this may be familiar, is an area of hills and ravines, forested, and nobody thinks an armored, mechanized army can pass through it. So the Ardennes front is used for weakest troops recovering from battle, while the strong forces are north and south of the Ardennes. Let me say this. This is the belief, even though the Germans attacked the French at the Ardennes in 1940. They showed up at Metz on the other side of the Ardennes, and nobody expected it. Hitler had already proven that his army can go through the Ardennes. Why we thought that it was an impassable barrier after Hitler used it as his primary highway into France just a few years before is beyond me. But they did. When the forces come out, things are worse. Because tens of thousands, I think certainly at least 10,000 German Americans went to Germany when America was still neutral in World War II. They were going to go fight for the fatherland. They were German-American Bundists who were pro-Nazi, or at least pro-German, proud of their heritage. Hitler got all these guys from all over Germany, put them in American uniforms, gave them American equipment. Many of them were going to be military police. They were infiltrated before the attack behind American lines. And they changed road signs, they directed traffic wrong so that our responses were chaotic, and whenever they could, they slaughtered isolated groups of American soldiers. Wherever they had an advantage, they'd shoot them in the back. This sows chaos. At first, our guys are reduced to pointing their weapons at other Americans, asking, who has the best legs of all the actresses in Hollywood? And the answer is Betty Grable. Everyone at that time knew that. Who was the most valuable player in the 1943 World Series? They asked pop culture questions that hoity-toity, fancy, stuffy Germans probably wouldn't know. And it worked, sort of. Although, God forbid, you were an American that just wasn't a baseball fan or into the legs of Hollywood actresses. Still, you'd probably not be shot. You'd probably be imprisoned. There's another thing, and it's hilarious. Our psychological warfare people wrote our identification papers with a flaw. When the Germans got a hold of them and copied them, they corrected the spelling of the word indentification. All of our identification papers were spelled indentification. The Germans assumed it was a typo, and being grammar Nazis, they corrected it. So if you found a guy with identification papers, he was a frickin' German spy. Only the indentification papers were real. They were so compulsive. Oh, but it's true. You can't make this stuff up. Battle of the Bulge is what it's called, because the Germans surge into our lines, but ultimately the Bulge is pushed out. We win. And at the beginning of the next year at Remagen, we capture a bridge over the Rhine. Patton attacks across the southern Rhine, and Montgomery, the British general, Field Marshal, attacks across the northern Rhine. Throughout early 1945, we're pushing eastward into Germany, and at this point, many Germans are fleeing to surrender to the Americans and the British because the Russians are so bestial. And where we'll leave it is where the Americans and Russians meet up on the Elbe River at a place called Torgau. And it's fun. The Russian soldiers kiss the Americans on the lips. The Americans go, what the hell? The Russians are saying, Tovarish, Tovarish, comrade, comrade, vodka, vodka. And the Americans go, Scotch, Scotch. And they drink and they dance and they have fun. And the men get along. The leaders don't trust each other at all. But the men get along. So Hitler's last plan, as the Battle of Berlin rages, is the hope that the Anglo-Saxons and the French will break their alliance with the Russians and vice versa. And that's where we'll leave things for tomorrow. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? I see none. Thank you for your attention. Thank you at home. Bye-bye.